Ben Carter had spent 17 years learning that life wasn't fair, and he was okay with that. While other boys his age trained with swords or studied ancient texts in the kingdom's grand libraries, Ben shoveled horse manure in the royal stables of Valmorn. His hands were calloused, his clothes always smelled faintly of hay and sweat, and nobody important ever bothered to learn his name. But Ben didn't mind. Horses didn't care about your bloodline or how much gold your family had. They just wanted someone who'd treat them right. The storm hit Valmorn on a Tuesday night, the kind of storm that made the old stable master mutter prayers to gods he claimed not to believe in. Rain hammered the wooden roof like 1,000 angry fists, and thunder shook the ground hard enough to spook even the calmest horses. Ben was making his final rounds, checking that every stall was secure, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not quite a crack, not quite a groan, but something in between. He found the source in the oldest section of the stables, a part they rarely use anymore. The western wall had collapsed inward, ancient stones tumbling like a child's blocks. Ben grabbed his lantern and stepped closer, expecting to find a mess he'd have to clean up come morning. Instead, he found darkness. Not the regular kind of darkness you get in a room without windows, but the deep, endless kind that makes your stomach drop. The collapsed wall had revealed a cavern. A massive one, by the look of it. Ben knew he should probably wait until morning, should probably tell someone official. But curiosity had always been his weakness, and the storm wasn't letting up any time soon. He held his lantern high and stepped through the gap in the wall. The cavern stretched beyond what his lantern could reach. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone teeth, and the air felt different here. Older, heavier. Ben's footsteps echoed as he ventured deeper, his heart pounding harder with each step. That's when his lantern light caught something that made him freeze. Scales. Massive, dulled scale that might have once shimmered like polished metal but now looked tarnished and forgotten. Ben's breath caught in his throat as his light traveled across what he'd thought was a rock formation. It wasn't a rock. It was a leg. A massive, clawed leg attached to a body so large that Ben couldn't see where it ended. A dragon. An actual dragon. Everyone knew dragons were extinct. They'd vanished from the world 300 years ago, back when Ben's great-great-great-grandparents were still young. The old stories spoke of a great war, of humanity driving the monsters back until they were nothing but legends and cautionary tales. Ben had heard those stories 100 times around campfires and tavern tables. He'd just never expected to find out they were wrong. His lantern shook in his hand as he stepped closer. The dragon's eyes were closed, its breathing so shallow that Ben had to watch carefully to see its chest rise and fall. The creature's scales, which should have gleamed with health and power, looked dull and brittle. Its massive frame seemed somehow diminished, like a once mighty oak tree slowly dying from the inside out. Common sense screamed at Ben to run. Every survival instinct his body possessed told him to get out of that cavern and never look back. But Ben had spent his whole life caring for animals, and something about the dragon condition bothered him more than his fear. This wasn't a monster ready to wake up and burn down villages. This was a dying creature that nobody even knew existed. He found 2 more as he explored deeper into the cavern. 3 dragons total, all in the same state of deep sleep and slow decline. The smallest one was only about 30 feet from nose to tail, which Ben supposed made it young by dragon standards. The middle one was twice that size, its scales darker and more weathered. The largest barely fit in the cavern at all, an ancient beast that must have been at least 100 feet long. Ben stood there for a long time, just watching them breathe. He thought about going back through that wall, pretending he'd never seen this. Nobody would blame him. Nobody would even know. But as he turned to leave, his lantern light caught the smallest dragon's face, and Ben saw something that changed everything. Dried tear tracks. Long, crystallized trails running from the dragon's closed eyes down across its snout. Whatever reason these creatures had for hiding here, for sleeping away from the world, it hadn't been a happy choice. Ben looked at his water flask and the half-eaten bread in his pocket. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in 17 years of mucking stalls and caring for horses that belonged to people who barely acknowledged his existence, Ben had learned one simple truth. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do. He set down his lantern and got to work. For 3 weeks, Ben lived 2 lives. By day, he was still the stable boy who nobody noticed, the kid who showed up before dawn and left after dark, smelling of horses and honest work. By night, he became something else entirely, a dragon keeper, a guardian of creatures the world had forgotten. He started small. Water first, carried in buckets from the well behind the stables when nobody was watching. The dragons didn't wake, didn't move, but Ben noticed their breathing grew slightly stronger after he managed to get some moisture into their mouths. Then came food, scraps from the kitchen that would have gone to the pigs anyway. Old bread, vegetable peels, anything he could sneak away without raising questions. The hardest part wasn't the physical work or even the fear. It was the loneliness. Ben had discovered something impossible, something that would change everything anyone thought they knew about the world, and he couldn't tell a single person. Who would believe him anyway? The crazy stable boy claiming he'd found living dragons? They'd lock him up or laugh him out of the kingdom. On the 23rd night, everything changed. Ben was checking on the smallest dragon like he did every evening, making sure the water he'd left was still fresh. He'd started talking to them during his visits, mostly because the silence in the cavern felt too heavy without it. He told them about his day, about the horse that had thrown his shoe, about the head stable master's bad jokes. Stupid stuff that probably didn't matter, but it made him feel less alone. That's when he felt it. A presence in his mind. Not words exactly, but something deeper than words. Feelings, curiosity, gratitude, warmth. Ben spun around so fast he nearly dropped his lantern. The smallest dragon's eyes were open. Not the fierce, terrible eyes from the old stories that could freeze a man's blood. These eyes were gentle, intelligent, and very, very tired. "Please don't eat me," Ben whispered, which felt like a stupid thing to say but was the only thing his terrified brain could come up with. The dragon made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a chuckle. Then Ben felt that presence in his mind again, stronger this time. Not threatening, almost amused. The dragon slowly, painfully, lowered her head until a massive snout rested on the cavern floor just inches from where Ben stood. More feelings flooded his mind. Gratitude, relief, wonder, and then, finally, something like words formed in his thoughts. Not spoken, but understood. "You are kind. You are the first kind one in so very long." Ben's legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the stone floor. "You can talk. In my head. You can actually talk. We can share thoughts. Yes, I am called Ember, young one, and you have saved my life." Ben looked at the buckets of water and scraps of food he'd been bringing. "I didn't really do much. Just tried to help. You did everything." Ember's mental voice carried a weight of sadness that made Ben's chest ache. "You could have run. You could have told your king, brought hunters, claimed glory for discovering dragons. Instead, you brought water to creatures who were dying of thirst. You brought food to beings your kind calls monsters. You asked for nothing, expected nothing. That is why I live." Over the next hour, Ember told Ben everything. How dragons hadn't gone extinct but had chosen to hide. How humanity's fear and greed had turned them from partners into targets. How 300 years ago, the dragon elders had made an impossible choice. Sleep or die, hide or be hunted to extinction. "We went deep into the earth," Ember explained. "We slowed our hearts, dimmed our fire, and waited. Waited for humanity to change. Waited for the fear to fade. Waited for someone, anyone, to remember that we were never the monsters they claimed." "But you've been sleeping for 300 years, Ben said. "Didn't anyone find you before now?" "Many found us. Treasure hunters. Night seeking glory. They saw us sleeping and helpless. And do you know what they did?" Ember's mental voice grew bitter. "They tried to take our scales, our claws, pieces of us to sell or mount on walls. We learned to sleep deeper, to hide better, to trust that humans had truly forgotten how to be kind." Ben felt sick. "That's horrible. That was humanity. Until you—" Ember lifted her head slightly, though the effort clearly cost her. "You saw creatures that could not defend themselves, and you helped. You saw beings the world had forgotten, and you remembered. That is rarer than any treasure, Ben Carter. That is worth waking for." "The other two?" Ben asked. "Your family?" "My brother, Ash, and our elder, Smoke. They sleep still. They will need time, but they will wake now because of what you have done. You have shown us that perhaps, just perhaps, humanity can still surprise us. Ben looked at this magnificent creature who could barely lift her head, who had lived through centuries of fear and hiding, and felt a determination settle in his chest. I'll keep helping, whatever you need. I don't care if nobody ever knows. You shouldn't have to hide anymore. Ember's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. Then, slowly and deliberately, she lowered her head again. But this time it was different. This time it was a bow, a gesture of respect from a creature that had lived longer than his entire bloodline. The bond, Ember whispered in his mind. It has been so long since a dragon bowed to a human, so long since one of us found a human worthy of respect. But you are, Ben Carter. You truly are. Ben reached out with a shaking hand and touched Ember's scales. They were warm despite everything, still holding some inner fire that 300 years of sleep couldn't extinguish. And in that moment, something changed in the world. Something old and powerful and long forgotten stirred back to life. The age of dragons hadn't ended after all. It had just been waiting for someone kind enough to wake it up. Life got complicated after Ember woke up. Ben had thought caring for 3 sleeping dragons was difficult, but caring for one awake dragon while keeping her existence secret turned out to be nearly impossible. Ember needed real food now, not just kitchen scraps. She needed space to move, even though she was still too weak to do much more than lift her head. And most importantly, she needed conversation. After 300 years of silence, Ember wanted to talk about everything. Ben learned more in those next few weeks than he'd learned in his entire life. Ember taught him about dragon history, about the old days when her kind had soared freely through the skies and humans had looked up in wonder instead of fear. She told him about dragon culture, their sense of honor, their deep connections to the earth and fire. She explained why dragons only bonded with certain humans, and why those bonds had become so rare. It is not about strength or intelligence, Ember explained one evening as Ben brushed dust from her scales. A dragon can sense what lies in a person's heart. Most humans approach us wanting something. Power, protection, glory. They see us as tools or trophies. But you came with only kindness. You saw suffering and wanted to ease it. That purity of purpose is what allows a true bond to form. I'm just a stable boy, Ben said for probably the 100th time. I'm nobody special. That is precisely what makes you special. Ember's mental voice carried warmth and something like amusement. You do not seek to be more than you are. You do not dream of conquest or fame. You are content with honest work and simple kindness. Do you know how rare that is? Ben didn't have an answer for that. He'd never thought of himself as rare. Just ordinary. Just trying to get by and maybe help where he could. The problem started on Wednesday. Ben had gotten careless, too comfortable with his nightly routine. He'd been hauling a large sack of meat scraps from the kitchen toward the old stable section when he ran straight into Daniel, one of the younger knights who sometimes trained near the stables. "What's in the sack, stable boy?" Daniel asked, more curious and suspicious. "Just spoiled meat for the pigs," Ben lied quickly. "That's a lot of spoiled meat. And you're heading the wrong direction. Pig pens are the other way." Ben's mind raced. Different pigs. Wild ones that come around sometimes. I've been leaving food out so they don't raid the good stores. Daniel looked unconvinced, but he shrugged and walked on. Ben's heart hammered in his chest. That had been too close. Way too close. But it got worse. Over the next few days, more people started noticing things. Strange sounds coming from the old stable section at night. The amount of water Ben was using. The way he always seemed tired, like he wasn't sleeping enough. Whispers started spreading among the stable workers. Nothing serious yet, but enough to make Ben nervous. Then came the night that changed everything. Ben arrived at the cabin to find Ember standing for the first time since she'd awakened. She was still weak, still unsteady, but she was on her feet. Her scales had begun to regain some of their luster, catching his lamplight and throwing it back in deep amber waves. "Ember, you're standing. Thanks to you, young friend. I grow stronger each day." She lowered her head in that gesture Ben had come to recognize as affection. "But we need to discuss something important. My brother and our elder will wake soon. When they do, they will not be as quiet as I have been. The kingdom will know dragons live here. What do we do?" "I do not know, But, Ben, you must understand something. When ash and smoke wake, they will judge humanity based on what they see first. If they wake to fear and weapons, they may decide humanity has not changed at all. But if they wake to kindness, to someone like you. A shout from outside the cavern cut her off. Torchlight flickered against the stone walls. Ben's blood turned to ice. In here. The sounds are coming from in here. At least 6 knights poured through a gap in the wall, swords drawn, torches held high. Their eyes went wide when they saw Ember. One of them screamed. Another dropped his torch entirely. Dragon. There's a dragon in the old stables. Ben stepped between Ember and the knights without thinking. Wait! Please, just wait. Get away from it, boy, shouted Sir Gregory, the captain of the guard. That thing will kill you. She won't. Her name is Ember, and she's not dangerous. Not dangerous. Gregory's face was pale, but his voice was steady. It's a dragon. Step aside before we're forced to go through you. Ben felt Ember's presence in his mind, felt her rage building like a storm. She could kill all 6 knights in seconds. Ben knew that. The knights probably knew that too, even if they were trying to be brave. One breath of fire and they'd be ash. Ember, no. Ben said quietly, not even turning around. Please, don't hurt them. They are just scared. They threaten you. They threaten me. I will not stand helpless while. You're not helpless. You're choosing mercy. That's different. That's better. Ben kept his eyes on the knights. If you kill them, you prove everything they've been told about dragons is true. If you let them live, you prove them wrong. Please, trust me. The silence stretched out so long that Ben could hear his own heartbeat. Then Ember did something that shocked everyone in that cavern. She lowered her head, not in aggression, but in submission. She allowed her wings to fold tight against her body. She made herself smaller, less threatening. For you, her mental voice whispered to Ben alone. Only for you would I do this. Sir Gregory wasted no time. He barked orders, and within minutes, chains were being brought. Heavy iron chains that they wrapped around Ember's legs and neck. She could have broken them easily, but she didn't. She let them bind her, her eyes never leaving Ben. You're under arrest for sorcery and conspiracy with monsters, Gregory told Ben, grabbing his arm roughly. The king will decide what to do with you. As they dragged Ben away, he looked back at Ember one last time. She was bound in chains, surrounded by armed knights, and completely at humanity's mercy, just like she'd been for 300 years of sleep. The only difference now was that she'd chosen it. She'd chosen to trust Ben's judgment over her own survival instinct. Ben just hoped that trust wouldn't get her killed. Always. Hoped it wouldn't prove to Ember that humanity really hadn't changed at all. The throne room of Valmorn had never felt so crowded or so hostile. Ben stood in the center of it all, his wrists bound in iron, surrounded by a circle of armed guards who looked like they expected him to sprout wings and breathe fire at any moment. Every noble in the kingdom seemed to have shown up for this. They lined the walls, filled the balconies, whispered behind jeweled hands. Ben had spent his whole life being invisible to these people. Now they couldn't stop staring at him. King Robert sat on his throne looking older than Ben remembered. His crown seemed too heavy for his head, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who just discovered the world wasn't what he thought it was. To his right stood Lord William, the king's chief adviser, his face twisted in barely concealed disgust. To his left sat Lady Catherine, the royal scholar, her expression unreadable. Ben Carter, the king's voice echoed through the hall. You stand accused of practicing dark sorcery and conspiring with a dragon. How do you answer these charges? Ben's throat was dry, but he forced himself to speak clearly. I haven't practiced any sorcery, Your Majesty, and I didn't conspire with anyone. I just tried to help. Help! Lord William's voice dripped with contempt. You hid a monster in the royal stables. You fed it, strengthened it, or while it plotted who knows what kind of destruction. She wasn't plotting anything. She was dying. All 3 of them were dying, and nobody even knew they existed. 3. The word rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. People who'd been whispering fell silent. There are 3 dragons. Ben realized his mistake too late, but there was no taking it back now. Yes, 3, but they are not monsters. They're just. Just what? William cut him off. Just creatures that burned entire villages in the old wars? Just beasts that our ancestors died fighting? The histories are clear, boy. Dragons are killers. The histories are wrong. Ben's voice came out louder than he intended, echoing off the stone walls. The guards tense, hands moving to sword hilts. But Ben was beyond caring about protocol now. Did your histories mention that dragons went into hiding because humans hunted them? That they chose to sleep rather than fight back? That they could have killed every treasure hunter who found them over the last 300 years but didn't? Lies fed to you by the creature, William said. Dragons are manipulative. Everyone knows that. Then why didn't Ember kill me the first time I found her? She was weak, vulnerable. I was alone. She could have made me her first meal in 3 centuries. Ben looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. Instead, do you know what she did? She thanked me. She cried because someone finally showed her kindness. This is absurd. William turned to the king. Your Majesty, we're wasting time. The boy is clearly under some kind of spell. We should execute him and the dragon immediately, before... Before what? Ben interrupted. Before you actually have to question whether maybe, just maybe, the stories you've been telling yourselves for 300 years are wrong? Before you have to face the fact that dragons didn't vanish because we beat them, but because we disappointed them so badly they'd rather sleep forever than deal with us anymore. The room erupted in angry shouts. Guards stepped closer. Someone threw something that bounced off Ben's shoulder. But through it all, Ben noticed Lady Catherine watching him with sharp, calculating eyes. She raised a hand, and somehow the room quieted. Your Majesty, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. If I may. King Robert nodded, looking almost relieved that someone else was taking charge. Catherine stood and walked to the center of the room, stopping a few feet from Ben. I have spent my life studying the old texts. Most of them speak of dragons as monsters. Yes, but there are older texts, rarer ones. They speak of bonds between humans and dragons, partnerships built on mutual respect. Fairy tales, William scoffed. Perhaps, or perhaps not. Catherine's eyes never left Ben. These texts say that dragons can only bond with humans who approach them without ulterior motives, without greed or desire for power. They say that when a true bond forms, the dragon bows its head to the human as a sign of respect. What's your point? The king asked. My point, Your Majesty, is that we have a way to test the boy's claims. If this dragon truly has bonded with him, it will protect him without being commanded to do so. But more importantly, it will submit peacefully when he asks it to. No spell, no manipulation could create that kind of trust. William looked furious. You want to unleash that monster in the castle. I want to know the truth, Catherine said simply. Don't you? The king was quiet for a long moment. Ben could see the fear in his eyes, but also something else. Curiosity, maybe, or hope that the world might be more complex than the simple stories he'd been raised on. Bring the dragon to the arena, King Robert finally said. Under heavy guard. We'll conduct Lady Catherine's test. An hour later, Ben stood in the royal arena with Ember. The chains had been removed at Catherine's insistence, though archers lined the walls with arrows already knocked. Ember looked weak and tired, but her eyes blazed with inner fire. The entire court watched from the safety of the elevated stands. Kill the boy, King Robert's voice rang out. It was a test? Ben knew, but hearing it still made his stomach drop. Ember moved faster than Ben expected, positioning herself between him and the archers. Her wings spread wide, blocking him completely. A collective gasp ran through the crowd. Several archers drew their bows back further. Now stop, Ben said quietly, just loud enough for Ember to hear. Please, stand down. Every instinct Ember had must have been screaming at her to fight or flee. She was outnumbered, surrounded by people who feared her. One wrong move and those arrows would fly. But she heard something in Ben's voice that mattered more than survival. She heard trust. Slowly, deliberately, Ember folded her wings. She stepped back from Ben, making herself vulnerable again. And then, in front of the entire kingdom, she lowered her head and bowed to a stable boy. The silence in the arena was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She trusted him completely. Catherine's voice carried across the arena. No magic, no manipulation. Just a bond built on something we'd forgotten was possible. Genuine, mutual respect between human and dragon. Ben reached out and placed his hand on Ember's head. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me, for believing in us." Always, Ember's mental voice was warm in his mind. "You showed me that humanity could change. Now we show them together." King Robert stood slowly, his face pale but his voice steady. "Ben Carter, you are pardoned of all charges." He paused, looking at Ember. "Perhaps it's time we stopped letting old fears write our future." The pardon should have been the end of the story. Ben should have gone back to the stables. Ember should have returned to her cavern, and life should have continued with just one impossible secret instead of none. But the universe had other plans. It happened 3 days after the trial. Ben was back in the cavern with Ember, bringing her fresh water and actually relaxing for the first time in weeks. The trial had gone better than he dared hope. King Robert had even ordered that proper food be provided for Ember, though most people still gave the old stable section a wide berth. Fear didn't disappear overnight, even when you knew it was unjustified. "Ben," Ember's mental voice suddenly carried a note of urgency. "My brother stays. And Smoke, they wake." Ben's heart jumped into his throat. "Now? Already?" "Your kindness revived me. My awakening calls to them. They feel that one of us has found hope again, and they rise to see if it's real." The cavern floor began to tremble. Dust rained from the ceiling. Ben stumbled backward as a larger dragon, Ash, open eyes that burned like molten copper. The massive creature lifted his head slowly, taking in his surroundings with ancient, wary intelligence. Then those eyes locked onto Ben. Ben felt a presence crash into his mind, not gentle like Ember's had been, but forceful and demanding. This was a dragon who'd seen the worst of humanity, who'd chosen extinction over coexistence. This was a dragon who had no reason to trust a trembling stable boy before him. "Brother, wait," Ember moved between them. "This one is different. This one saved us." "So you say, little sister. But I remember the last different human, the one who spoke of peace while his friends sharpened their blades in the shadows." Ash's mental voice was deep and scarred with old pain. "I remember the children who threw stones at dragons for sport, the kings who wore our scales as crowns. Give me one reason why I should not end this foolishness now." Before Ben could answer, the largest dragon began to move. Smoke was even more massive than Ben had realized. When she lifted her head, it nearly touched the cavern ceiling. Her scales were the color of storm clouds, and her eyes held the weight of centuries. She looked at Ben for a long moment, then at Ember, then back to Ben again. The youngling speaks truth. Smoke's mental voice was like distant thunder. "I feel no deception in her. But feelings can be fooled, and hope can blind even dragons. Boy, speak. Tell me why my kin should not return to sleep, and leave your kind to your own devices." Ben's mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stand straight. These dragons deserved honesty, not cowering. "I can't give you a reason why all of humanity deserves a second chance," Ben said carefully. "I've met too many cruel people, too many greedy ones, too many who'd probably tried to hurt you given half a chance." He saw Ash's eyes narrow, so smoke began to curl from the dragon's nostrils. But he pushed on. "But I can tell you what I've learned working in the stables all these years. And what wisdom does a stable boy possess?" Ash's tone was mocking. "That you can't judge everyone by the worst people. Yeah, some nobles are cruel to their horses. They whip them, overwork them, treat them like objects. But some are kind. Some talk to their horses gently, make sure they are well fed, care about their comfort." Ben looked Smoke in the eye. "And the thing is, the horses can tell the difference. They know who's worth trusting. Maybe dragons can too." "Pretty words," Ash rumbled. "But words are wind. Actions matter." "Then judge me by my actions," Ben said. "I found 3 dying dragons and didn't tell anyone who could hurt you. I brought you water and food when you couldn't defend yourselves. I stood between Ember and knights with swords. I asked her not to kill people even when they wanted to kill her, and she trusted me enough to do it." He gestured to Ember. "Your sister bowed to me. Not because I commanded her, not because I had power over her, but because she decided I was worth respecting. If you can't trust humans, fine, but can you trust a judgment? The silence stretched out so long that Ben could hear his own heartbeat. Ash and Smoke looked at each other, and Ben sensed some wordless conversation passing between them. Finally, Smoke turned back to him. You speak well, young one, but the question remains, are you an exception, or are you evidence that humanity has truly changed? I don't know, Ben admitted, but here's what I do know. When I brought you here to the arena for the trial, hundreds of people saw Ember. They saw a dragon for the first time in their lives. And yes, they were scared. But they also listened when I spoke. They watched when she bowed. They are starting to question the stories they've been told their whole lives. Starting to question is not the same as changing, Ash said. No, but it's a beginning, and beginnings matter. Ben felt his confidence growing. 300 years ago, you went to sleep because humanity disappointed you. But maybe we needed that time. Maybe we needed to live without dragons to realize what we lost. Maybe we needed someone like me, someone ordinary and unimportant, to show everyone else that the old ways were wrong. Smoke made a sound that might have been a chuckle. You call yourself ordinary, yet you did what no hero or king accomplished in 3 centuries. You woke us with nothing but kindness. Because kindness was what you needed, not swords or spells or grand speeches. Just someone who saw you suffering and wanted to help. Ben spread his hands. That's not special. That's just being decent. And if being decent is enough to earn a dragon's respect, then maybe there's more decent people out there than you think. Maybe they just need to see that it's possible first. Ash moved closer, his enormous head lowering to Ben's level. For a terrifying moment, Ben thought the dragon might eat him. Instead, Ash studied him with those ancient eyes. You have courage, stable boy, perhaps more than you know. To stand before dragons and speak truth takes strength. Ash glanced at his sister. Ember judges you worthy. That carries weight. Then Ash did something that made Ben's knees nearly buckle. The massive dragon lowered his head in a bow. Not quite as deep as Ember's had been, but unmistakable. I do not trust easily, Ash's mental voice rumbled. But I trust my sister, and she trusts you. That will suffice. For now. Smoke was the last. The ancient dragon regarded Ben with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. When she spoke, her mental voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The boy is correct about one thing. Beginnings matter. And perhaps it is fitting that this new beginning comes not from kings or warriors, but from a stable boy who simply chose kindness. Smoke lowered her massive head, her bow shaking dust from the cavern ceiling. We will give humanity another chance, Ben Carter. But understand this, we give that chance because of what you represent. Compassion for the forgotten, courage to do right when no one watches, the strength to choose mercy over violence. Ben felt tears on his cheeks and didn't bother wiping them away. I won't let you down. See that you don't, Smoke said, but there was warmth in her voice now. Because the world will be watching. When word spreads that 3 ancient dragons have returned and sworn themselves to a stable boy's service, humanity will have questions. They will wonder what makes you special. But I'm not. You are, Ember interrupted gently. Not because of who you are, but because of what you chose to do. That choice will define not just your life, Ben, but the future of both our kinds. The next morning, when the 3 dragons emerged from the cavern into sunlight for the first time in 300 years, all of Valmorn stopped. People poured into the streets, faces pale with fear and wonder. The dragons could have flown away, could have left humanity behind again. Instead, they walked through the city to the castle, and there, in front of King Robert and thousands of witnesses, all 3 dragons bowed their heads to Ben Carter. The king stepped forward, his voice carrying across the crowd. Let it be known throughout the kingdom that dragons have returned, and they have chosen to judge us not by our mightiest warriors or wisest scholars, but by how we treat those with no voice and no power. They have chosen a stable boy because he embodied what we had forgotten, kindness without expectation, compassion for the forgotten, courage to do right when no one was watching. Ben stood there, surrounded by dragons who could have ruled the world, but chose instead to place their trust in simple human decency. And he realized something important. He was still a stable boy. He still smelled like hay and honest work. His hands were still calloused, his clothes still worn. But now he tended dragons. And through that simple act of caring for creatures everyone else had forgotten, he'd reminded the world what it meant to be human.